So hello everybody, welcome to this first ESMTB colloquium in 2022. I have an honor to welcome here today's speaker Hanna Kokko, a world-leading expert in evolutionary biology in general and theoretical evolutionary biology specifically. I have known Hanna, if I may say that, for about 24 years, following her achievements since our interests sometimes crossed. And I dare to say that these achievements are really astonishing. So I really hope that we will all enjoy the talk today. And I have also visited some of her plenary talks at various events and have always been shocked in a positive sense by her rhetorics and by her enthusiasm in which she passed her research onto all of us. So this makes me sure that we all will enjoy her talk today. So Hanna, please, the stage is yours.
Thanks so much, Ludek. I'll just get straight away started with this beautiful picture of the Earth here, which is what it looked like roughly in the Eocene. And I just sort of ask you to imagine what it would be like to be a creature that is really trying to live forever. This is always in some parts of society, this is kind of like the dream. So let's say that you are born in the Eocene, and maybe you are born in this nice archipelago that is Europe, or maybe you're beautifully adapted to the coastal forests of Antarctica. And you of course see where I'm getting here, that it's actually going to be quite challenging to think that your adaptations will be still valid today if you really try to live forever. Or if we take an even longer time scale, if you were born or hatched from an egg during the time of the dinosaurs, then of course at some point there will be this global firestorm when the meteor hit at one part of the planet, and if you were on the opposite side, there was intense heat destroying all the forests. So how are you going to be adapted to everything that follows thereafter when there are no trees around? Or even over shorter timescales, the point here is that the environments are always changing. So if you're trying to sort of be cool and sing the disco songs from the 1980s, then at some point, maybe the social environment around you has just changed a bit, and things just don't work as well as back then in your youth. And this is, of course, a general principle in life. You don't have to think about the longest timescales for this to be valid. Life has opted for an approach where you are not really trying to keep one organism adapted and completely intact and non-senescing forever, but instead there's reproduction. So individuals make copies about themselves. I have sort of copies-ish here as a phrase because there's always going to be mutation, there's sexual reproduction and so on. But then essentially you hope that some of them will make it in this new world that is eventually happening. But of course, I mean, this is just verbal blah, blah. So in reality, we have this incredible diversity that we have something, even if you just think about birds, we have something like the blue tit, where there's immensely many offspring per year, but a blue tit is already old on average compared to the average member of the population if that blue tit is 2 years old. Or then we have something like this particular individual here. Wisdom is the name of this specific individual female Laysan albatross. She's about the age of my mother, but unlike my mother, she's actually still reproducing every year, and she has her own Twitter account, and I think she is successfully breeding this year again. So this is just kind of like just the sort of general framework of questions that interest me at the moment. And here's a younger colleague of mine, Irja Ratikainen, and we have been in this sort of mentorship relationship for a long time, where there's a Norwegian-funded chance for us to meet in nice places, for example, on hiking trips, either in Switzerland or Norway, and we just brainstorm about career prospects, but also scientific topics, and we end up collaborating now and then. And we ended up thinking about the fact that all these questions about how to keep up to date in life when the environment is varying, there's this plasticity component to it. You could call it learning if it's dictated by the brain, but it could also be some sort of morphological plasticity, whatever kind of changes in the organism. And these slow, fast life histories, they seem to have some sort of relation to whether you expect more or less plasticity in this creature. So intuitively, you would say that if you are a long-lived organism, where this has to be interpreted in relation to the environmental cycles that you might be experiencing, that should probably favor lifelong learning or this sort of reversible plasticity between different kinds of morphs or phenotypes. And also intuition suggests that if you live in a particularly stable environment, then that probably, without you doing anything about this, it makes an organism stay sort of valid for longer without becoming outdated. But when you look at the literature on this, there's some theoretical papers, there's also some empirical papers. If I just sort of give a taste of the empirical stuff here, like here's, for example, a paper that tried to look at quite a crude measure of how flexible you might be. This is just a relative brain size measurement. And indeed, there's some sort of correlation with longer lifespans. There's also another paper which had 135 bird species in there, and the large brain species, there were all kinds of associations, and one of them was the slow life history traits. But the actual, even though the slowness was measured with various proxies, they didn't actually look at lifespan specifically. You can also look at the sort of learning capacity, even in these quite small organisms like butterflies. Admittedly, this paper just has 4 species in there, but among these 4 species examined, the larger and longer lived species exhibited higher learning rates about things like, where is the food right now, and do I actually bother learning it, or do I just fly randomly around? So there's quite a sort of strong tendency in the literature to talk about a long life as setting the scene for the evolution of plasticity. But of course, I mean, you could consider, maybe this is not the only arrow that there is. If you think about examples such as in this paper here, they were looking at innovation propensity. So innovation refers to things like this here. There are these famous examples of corvids that use, in this case, traffic lights. They put some tasty food item on the road. The food item is covered in some sort of hard shell that they cannot crack otherwise. But then when the light turns green, the cars drive over it, and then your meal is ready. So this is very smart. And as you can imagine, there's some correlation with brain size, and also the lifespan goes into there. But of course, being careful scientists, they are concluding that, well, we don't really know for sure what causes what, because it could also be correlated evolution if both enhanced innovativeness and long lifespan provide benefits under similar selective pressures, that there could be some sort of a third variable that is underlying the ecologies underlying the development of both traits without one actually being the cause of the other. So this is kind of like the framework where we wanted to step in. We wanted to think about including at least one more arrow into this picture of long life selecting for plasticity. Namely, it could also be that if you are quite a plastic organism, either through learning or some other kinds of measuring the environment and changing your phenotype, this could actually select for a longer life. So the sort of verbal, the intuitive reasoning here is that if you for some reason struggle to cope with environmental change, like learning how these phones work, then it is a fact of life that you'll be outdated sooner or later. So that then would mean that you should probably emphasize reproduction early on in your life, because later you're going to be a little bit useless. Whereas if, on the other hand, you're some sort of a creature that is quite good at figuring out the new things that have to be done in the world, you're simply less likely to become outdated as you get older. So this then, in a life history sense, will emphasize reaping the benefits at a more gentle pace, and you could evolve a slower life history. There's some drilling going on around here in this building. I hope you don't hear that too badly. So the model that we then produced is this potentially lifelong plasticity. When is it selected for and when is it not? Where we model the environment as some sort of temporal variation with some autocorrelation in there. and you are trying to track with your trait, unidimensional trait, what to do best. And we model the learning efficiency or the degree of plasticity, which we use synonymously here, as something like this. If you have stayed a long time without figuring out whether it's time for you to update your phenotype, then you have a high probability of trying to do so. But some creatures could make that probability 100% pretty much immediately since you last updated after one time step. So this is the extreme lifelong learner phenotype. Or then this could be a really shallow curve, you assume that whatever you learned as a juvenile, this is valid for an incredibly long time. And every possible thing in between is also included as an option here. And just a quick list of the model assumptions. We assume that if you do match your environment nicely, then this leads to better survival. But the updating itself is actually costly. You have to do something, you have to spend energy that you would otherwise use for something else. So by itself, this reduces survival. And we have the life history model underlying this, so that reproductive effort is also something that you have to do. But this reduces parental survival. And when we put all of these things in there together, I just go straight to some of the results here. So the first result slide here is actually only taking into account one of the arrows, where we simulate an experiment where we somehow force the organism to have a certain scheduling of plasticity in there. And we see, is there really an effect, selective response to creating a longer lifespan? So what if we could manipulate plasticity and see how lifespan goes on? So here, just to explain the x-axis, the really low numbers for the updating effort, this basically means that this organism is forced to never ever be plastic. Here it's forced to kind of update and measure the environment all the time. And here indeed, we get the evolution of fast life with fast-paced reproduction and a short lifespan. This is the lifespan, at least for 2 out of the depicted 3 autocorrelations in here, you can see that it's quite low. Whereas the opposite happens at this end, where you get the evolution of slow life, you have slow-paced reproduction and a long lifespan. And I only showed the lifespan here. The next slide has the reproduction. Before I go to this, next slide. This is basically just showing that the long life can be an outcome of plasticity, because being old now really doesn't correlate with being outdated, because you are at this end updating yourself all the time. This is actually what happens when you do a Google image search for the term smart granny. So this is kind of like this end of the spectrum. And I already said that this result ceases to be true if the environment hardly changes. It's actually quite an obvious result when you start thinking about it. Natural selection just produces the best phenotype and best genotype anyway, so there's not much scope for plasticity in the first place. And I already promised you this next slide. This is just a flip side of what I said earlier. It's the same experiment, same x-axis, but now I've just graphed this other trait in there. Reproductive effort goes high in those conditions where the lifespan as a response then is low. We can also do exactly the opposite experiment. So this is kind of like the old arrow in terms of what has been discussed a lot in the literature. So here what we do is to keep the life slow or fast, and then we see how plasticity evolves. So instead of from plasticity to long life, we now do the opposite. As the measure of slow or fast here, we have the reproductive effort. If it is high, we indeed get a low short lifespans here. If it is small, we indeed get the longer lifespans here. And you can see that once again, for 2 out of the 3 examples here, this is the one where the environment doesn't really vary. The updating effort behaves as predicted. So when we then have both of these arrows co-occurring, in these previous examples, I always kept one trait fixed and then wanted to see what the other type is doing, then you get these all kinds of interesting thoughts, like, there might actually be multiple equilibria, and life could sort of sometimes go one way or the other way, just depending on tiny little differences of what's happening in the beginning. And so if once again, I start with the verbal reasoning that is underlying this next analysis, is that if you're an organism that starts with a tiny bit of a poor ability to reinvent itself, so you're not very plastic, then it seems to be better to try to make most of your life while you're still young, because later things are going to go wrong for you. This emphasizes selection for an even shorter lifespan in order to have lots of energy available in the early life. You get a fast life history, and that then, according to the other type of arrow, leads to even less selection to update as an adult. So the whole adjusting to new environments is kind of like outsourced to just producing lots of offspring who then can try to figure out what to do, either based on genetic or environmental cues. On the other hand, if you start with a tiny bit better ability to reinvent yourself, so you are a little bit plastic to begin with, then this, relative to the first example, it's a bit better to reap the continued benefits of being plastic and keeping updated quite late in life. And this, of course, means that you're more likely to be productive late in your life. So you get selection for longevity, you get a slower life history. And now both adults and juveniles are the ones who resample what the environment is requiring from them. So you get into this kind of lifelong learning type. But do these multiple equilibria really happen, or could it be that from wherever you start, you might just sort of end up in the middle and you haven't really explained much of the variation? So this is what the model actually is producing. The most exciting version of our intuition, which would be kind of very clear multiple equilibria, that wasn't really happening in our model. Such is life, I guess. It would have happened if you can maybe see these sort of tiny little dots here. These are all kinds of different starting conditions with a combined trait of reproductive effort and updating effort here. We started them at, for this example, with 2 different rows of values. And if there had been multiple equilibria, then all of the ones on the left, roughly, they would end up here in the fast life, some sort of a dot here. And all of the ones on the right, they would end up with some sort of a slow life with a lower reproductive effort. What actually happened was this. So different starting points. Mostly, we have some counterexamples in the paper, but mostly you just end up with in this worm in the middle, where things are then free to drift around a bit more. And the reason seems to be that it's really wrong for the organism if you get the lifespan reproductive effort trade-off wrong. If you follow the wrong style of life history, you're really penalized a lot compared to your competitors. Whereas the suboptimal plasticity scheduling, here you're varying along that axis, the strength of selection is simply a lot weaker along that axis. So if we kind of produce a summary slide of what do we then actually predict for different kinds of organisms, we can change the ecology of the organism. There's this sort of color gradient here, which is about the stability of the environment. We can also make different assumptions. These are the shapes here about how easy is the task for the organism to actually figure out what is going on around it in the environment. So this is measured with this sampling error here. And then we get these different clouds of where the organisms end up. So if you live in quite a stable world, so these are the yellow colors here, and if you can measure the world not so particularly well, then basically you end up just trusting what evolution already equipped you with. Why bother learning anything? Because you're not such a great learner and the world is stable. But we also get these species out there where life actually does make you outdated as you get older. But it might still be best not to try to fight that. Instead, what you do end up doing is a lot of reproduction. Produce them while you're young enough to have a clue, and then you just see how long you can do this. finally, here we have a case in this corner where the environment varies a lot. These are the dark blue colors here. And particularly at the lowest end here, you do have a very good clue of what's going on. That's when you end up with this smart granny like lifelong learners. So that was the sort of first story that I wanted to tell you about. The key insight being so far that a lot of life history evolution can actually be driven by the fact that the world is different when you're young versus when you're older. And the first example, the first paper I talked about was about individuals just doing their life history thing without taking into account what the others are doing. But a lot of life is actually social. And I just put this picture in here, not because I'm talking about Andres's work next. He is actually a PhD student of mine from earlier years, but just because he told me once a very nice metaphor about his life in Finland while he was in my lab. This is not a finished picture, obviously. But he said that if you're trying to develop friendships, he is from Spain originally. In Spain, it's a bit like an R-selected process where you gain a lot of initial, some sort of friends, but then only over time you realize that, you know, many of them also disappeared. Whereas in Finland, you make friends in a much more K-selected way, where the rate of acquiring new friends is actually really low. But once you have them, you kind of keep them forever. It's a nice metaphor, and I'll just sort of move on to another metaphor that is related to this location where I've spent much of my pandemic staring at this landscape here. And I particularly, I would like to point out that there's a village down there in the valley. And you can probably imagine that life there, when it comes to the friendship dynamics, might be quite different to life in a big city like this one here. And this sort of idea is actually what I was interested in making connections with the aging literature and the development of social relationships. What do friendships have to do with senescence? So this is a wonderful paper by McCluskov and Chapman from a couple of years ago, where effectively they are making the point that whatever you do in life, in this case, they are not interested in really social behaviors, but just the function of an organism, that it might be that you get a certain kind of curve of how well during ontogeny you are performing. And depending on how you organize the gene expression and everything inside your body, there might be different alternatives. This one here, for example, you're not so optimized for early life, but you do therefore develop a very well-functioning body when you're older. And much depends then whether you should actually follow the red curve or the blue curve, depends on what are actually the chances that you're still alive at different parts of your, or at different ages. So if most of your life is likely to be spent in the young ages because mortality is very high, that's when it doesn't really matter very much that the blue curve here is higher than the red curve, because you're very unlikely to live long enough to experience this difference. Whereas if you live in a much more, or let's say if the mortality in the environment that is causing on you is quite low, you're much more likely to reach the point in your life where you can actually reap the benefits of the blue curve being above the red. So coming back to the sort of social part of this story, so this is work of a postdoc in my lab, Thomas Aubier. If you take inspiration from, for example, vampire bat biology, where it's really essential to have these social interactions with conspecifics, otherwise you really cannot survive very long, then given that everything, you know, investment in one type of friendship with one conspecific, nurturing that might trade off with how much you are friends with somebody else. In the vampire bat biology, this is very concrete because they actually share blood meals. If one has failed to eat in a given night, they might beg for a donation from somebody who comes back with a full belly. And of course, this is not something that you can do with a lot of individuals every night. but you might still diversify your investments because, you know, sometimes you answer to, you know, whoever is around you first. And sometimes you really just, you might have your own favorite friend and you reject everybody else's begging. So we wanted to model how this actually works out as a ideal or optimal strategy of investment in few stable friendships or many shallow ones. So if you take the metaphor of the big city and the tiny village, you can sort of imagine what you would maybe predict there. So what we did here is to assume that some of your friends sometimes just die or disappear, emigrate, or whatever. And we call this the volatility of the social environment here. And you can already sort of try to think, you know, what direction of predictions would you make? When do individuals form most focused relationships? And when do they do what might be called some kind of like social bed hedging, that, you know, if that person is not there, then I still have the others around me. So here's the postdoc who actually did all the work with the question, if there's a lot of volatility in group membership, does this really lead to many shallow friendships, as you might intuitively predict? And he did this by assuming that there's basically two different kinds of social traits, and both of them are about the propensity to interact narrowly, just with those individuals who you already know, and not respond so nicely to strangers. And there are two different traits, because this can be applied to two different states of the individual. One is when you're yourself unfed, or when you're yourself well fed. And when we do this, we actually found the exact opposite to what the kind of human friendship-based intuition might suggest here. So when we moved the environment from the stable to the volatile kind, we actually got an increase in the direction of more focused friendships. And this happened for both of these traits. And it's a bit of a puzzle, because it really is quite counterintuitive. And I think it only starts making sense once you start really linking the ideas of social behavior and friendships to these ideas of aging, and the fact that the importance of what happens to you in early life versus late life vary according to how long your own lifespan might be. So here's again the sort of red curve, blue curve type argument. If you, so this is actually the first graph here. This is actually sort of hypothetical data that the model is producing. This is model output. You can see that being of the sort of red type does actually lead to better performance. This is survival over a particular time unit when you're young. And it's only late in life when you actually do start benefiting greatly from having this large network of friends. So it really captures this sort of contrast that I was just drawing on hypothetical curves here earlier. So if much of your life is spent early, and then later you're dead, then you probably should follow the red curve. Whereas if you're in a less volatile environment, mortalities are low, then it really starts to matter that here you are better off when you diversify your investments. And I think this is sort of a beautiful example of a kind of like a thinking, I'm not sure it's actually a fallacy, but it's kind of like some sort of thinking error that we easily make when we think about, oh, what would happen to me if I live in a volatile environment or not? You kind of put yourself in the shoe of an individual whose friend is suddenly dead, and then kind of like, oh no, what happens to me now? But you don't easily think that, you know, it could also be me who is dead, and then whatever happened to me until now is the only fitness I ever got. And that's kind of like the reason for this really quite counterintuitive results that we got in there. So yeah, we can actually, I mean, so far I've already shown you two examples where the lifespan and other traits covariation, it takes quite interesting forms. I was already alluding to the role of social behavior in there. And if I come back to these first two examples that I showed you, the blue tit and the lace and albatross, they are not actually social creatures in the sense of forming groups with a lot of interactions, more than two individuals in any complicated sense. But there are systems with breeders and helpers, and you probably do know that there's this literature on cooperative breeding, which I've been also interested in for a long time. So I'm going through some slightly older papers of mine for the next section of this talk, which is, when do you actually expect social behavior to evolve? Because there is an undeniable link. It's much discussed whether it always applies, but there's certainly an idea that many small, if I go back to, excuse me, this slide here, many small birds can be surprisingly long-lived, but this tends to be the case in those species that also have these structures with helpers, and they form more complicated social dynamics than, for example, the blue-tipped in Europe. So this seems to be a phenomenon out there where there's sort of a pattern. You see a potential explanation, and then you think, oh yeah, that's it, we have nailed it. But when you look at it more closely, this might actually not be the case quite yet. And what I mean by this claim is that here are the facts. So many cooperative breeders are long-lived. Another fact about them is that young individuals in cooperative breeders, they stay at home. They don't disperse and try to breed on their own, but they stay at home and they often do something helpful there. And also, if there's habitat constraints, everywhere is full of breeders. That makes it actually very hard for them to use the option of leaving to find their own nest places. So that seems to be then the explanation, that we have these long-lived breeders. That's why we get the correlations with lifespan. If the breeders elsewhere are just refusing to die, everywhere will be full for a long time. Vacancies are rare. So therefore, of course, the best option for an individual to do is to stay at home and help the parents to reproduce one more time or something like that. But when you start thinking about it, if I kind of dissect the logical argument that we were just doing here, is that now we are taking the long life in a creature as a premise. And then we say that, well, that has the effect that habitats will be full. And that then selects for social behavior where you stay at home and interact with your parents for a prolonged time. But what you then haven't actually checked is what happens to the argument if you assume an organism that has a short life. So if you, instead of just sort of doing your scenario building in this part of the world, you really need to check the dynamics that happens when the life is short. And I would claim that that also very easily leads to full habitats. And why do I claim that? It's because of this fast-slow continuum and the fact that short-lived organisms tend to have very high fecundity. They invest in that rather than keeping their bodies robust for a long time. So that means that when you produce very many competitors for the few vacancies, or maybe a bit more vacancies that are there, everything gets full anyway. So once again, from the perspective of an individual little creature here, young one, it's once again really hard to find your own place in the world. So wouldn't this then also predict social behavior? And yet it doesn't. So that's, I'm not even really sure if this should be assigned to the category of a particular logical fallacy. I think it's sort of the emphasis that you put in this one scenario here, it's kind of like a bit of a confirmation bias. If you want to study social behavior, you of course choose a social species to study in the first place. You don't really contrast very easily your arguments with the other type. But at least it shows that, there is something of a problem that we need to think about how it can be resolved. If both A and not A can make it difficult to secure an independent breeding position, then is there actually an asymmetry that one of them predicts social behavior better than the other? This is something that interested me already quite a long time ago. So this is one of the papers where we tried to put together the arguments for why A rather than not A will actually more reliably lead to social behavior. So at least two reasons behind this. And one of them for me goes actually even further back in time. So this is kind of like a paper that I published during roughly that time that Ludek was alluding to when we two first met. It's the idea that if you are interacting together with a dominant, so you have stayed at home, there's some dominant breeder who may or may not be your mother, and you're trying to succeed by being at home simply by hoping that you might actually end up in a situation where you inherit the local territory because the breeder is now dead. And the probability that this ever happens before you also are dead, that's given by these curves here. And you can see that overall there's an increasing tendency with the survival. It's kind of like a species broad survival measure. But at the end, it goes in totally different directions, depending on whether the dominant is the shorter lived one of you two, or whether you as the subordinate are the shorter lived one of the dominant and breeder comparison. And this is what happens if you both live equally long. It's then quite logical that it's just a 50-50 chance that one of you dies first. So that is the first reason to potentially stay at home if there's long life, this fact that often you actually do get these increases with survival. In other words, breeders are long-lived, so the wait will be longer, but then you are also long-lived, so therefore you can afford to wait so long. And this is the equation that just captures the effect in a nutshell. So this is kind of like the arrow from a slow life history to social behavior. But there's also this other arrow present. And I think the first people who did publish this, that was actually not from my lab at all. This was Ridley and Sutherland 2002, which is that if you are a social behavior creature, and your offspring are staying at home, staying as helpers, and they are hoping to get something out of this by eventually inheriting the territory, then there's actually diminishing returns to producing more offspring, because not all of them are going to inherit. They just start competing locally with each other. So for those of you who are familiar with local mate competition theory, it's kind of like the same effect, but there it's applied to whether you should be producing males or females. Here I'm applying it to whether you should produce more offspring in the first place, or should you just try to live yourself for longer. That's how the links to life history theory come about. So what actually then does determine whether it's the subordinates who are the shorter lived ones, that's this assumption set here, or the longer lived ones than the dominants? They might have less access to food if the dominant is kind of like an asshole, but often there's actually evidence that being dominant is also a stressful part of anybody's life cycle, so it could go in any way. But if we just have a look at how modelers have looked at this, a few years ago, Rodriguez and myself, we compiled this table about helping behavior as a whole, or altruistic behavior, of what kind of assumptions people have made when it comes to, text is so small, I'll make it a bit bigger here. It's kind of like, firstly, the first axis here is who helps whom. Is it just some sort of abstract individuals that are kind of peers to each other? Or is it offspring helping the mother? Or is it a general kind of subordinate helping a dominant? Or sib-sib, that's very rare assumption, but there is a model out there. Or some sort of other structures. And here in the columns, what I'm showing is whether there's an abstract fitness that is being sort of passed on from one individual to another. This is often then done in discrete generation frameworks. Is it a fecundity benefit? That is, your fecundity is improved if you receive help. Is it your survival that is improved if you receive help? This, of course, requires that you don't make the assumption of discrete generations. You probably should have overlapping ones so that survival can go on. Or could it be both? And the point of this table is that there's sort of gaps here and there. There's much more research effort on certain kind of assumption structures than others. And I'm particularly interested in this both column here, because this is the only column where you really can have the phenomenon called load lightening play a role. This is something that is often found in cooperative breeders, where if a parent is receiving help, you don't actually necessarily get a higher fecundity at the moment, because you might invest it into, yourself doing a little bit less work, feeding the young who are present right now. You are young, but you don't have to feed for them. You can just relax a little, have a better functioning soma, live better to the next year. And you get these interesting feedbacks between life history theory and helping. But of course, it also means that from the perspective of a young helper, if you're just making your dominant live longer, that means that if you were hoping to inherit the local territory, you're just shooting yourself in your foot. So this is another way to ask the same question, but this is sort of more genetically oriented way, is why would you actually evolve a short, dangerous lifestyle if you are, after all, you are inheriting the genes from the dominants? Especially if you think about something like a social insect, it could be some sort of a wasp, or it could be an ant, or it could be a mole rat. I mean, the queen is the only one who's reproducing. You inherit your genes from the queen. So technically, you already know how to switch on those genes that promote lifespan the best. But you might instead end up a worker who lives a dangerous life and also might not be built for robustness to even expect such a long lifespan, even if you are living very benign conditions. And I just show this paper here. It's not from my lab at all, but we had it in our journal club, and we felt it was a fantastic example of this phenomenon that the genes are there. This is a case where ant workers can be infected. And if they are infected, if they have this parasite, they become lazy, so to say, and they also become much more long-lived. They just sort of relax and hang around in the nest. From a parasite's perspective, this makes sense, because they stay around longer to then be eventually digested by a predator of these ants, and the parasite gets to the next stage. But from the ants' perspective, it's fascinating, because it does suggest that when these queen-like phenotypes are not switched on in the workers, it seems that selection actually has actively favored the workers becoming a bit more sort of ready to sacrifice themselves for the good of the colony. So we wanted to model this sort of thing, why would you evolve to a short lifespan in this setting? One is that it's kind of just unavoidable, that the workers have to do the work, and that is hard. Or then maybe they are in some sense replaceable, because if they help the queen to produce new ones, then that's kind of like recycling the effort in a way. And you're also living a dangerous life. You go outside the nest, at least in many of the species, and then you die anyway. So we are in the process of modeling this thing. We haven't actually yet finalized the model output. We have been finalizing some other projects in between. So this is work by Lotte and Rob, where we do have these worker phenotypes. They are based on that of the queen, but they have some worker-specific expression that is then also evolving. And we have different model variants in here, and this is to make the predictions of when precisely do you end up with shorter worker lifespans than the queen lifespans. Is the new queen, if a queen dies, is the new queen coming from the outside or inside? So is there this possibility for careers to progress from the inside? Does the queen use the help to improve her fecundity, lifespan, or both? And does maintaining a robust body trade off with fecundity in the queens or work in workers? We model this with the two demographers. This will be a familiar figure. The Gompertz-Makeham curves, where you start off your life with mostly just extrinsic mortality, determining if you're still alive. But at some point you start senescing so that you get a much more rapid curve. And this parameter here tells us effectively, like, how robustly are you built? Are you planning to die at age 20 or at age 40 or whatever, shorter lifespans here? The lifespans, as a result, they can evolve to be really, really, really different between the queens and the workers. But the fact that workers are exposed to more risk is actually not the strongest driver of senescence evolution, according to our results. We have a lot of scenarios where we actually predict only mild lifespan differences between the queens and the workers. So here's the planning to die when parameter, for the want of a better word. And here's generations, and this thing here is the queens, and the lower blurrier graph is what evolves in the workers. And you can see that, yeah, there's a difference, but it's nowhere of the magnitude that you see in, for example, real ant colonies. But if we do switch on this possibility for load lightening, that is then the fact that allows the queen to live much longer and workers actively evolving shorter lifespans in order to be able to help the queen be so much more productive. This happens quite reliably in the model. There is a but, and the but is that it stops working in terms of producing this huge difference if the workers can get a chance to become the new queen when the queen is dead. And you can see what's going on in there. Suddenly there's this selfish benefit of trying to be the one who is still alive at this unpredictable moment when the queen is actually dead. And then you get, once again, much more closely aligned lifespans. So that's work in progress. And just because I already started talking a bit about insects, I'll now go to the final example of my talk here. And now I step away from the social world. This is not an insect that builds any sort of colonies or things like that. And it's a way, way, way shorter lived creature than what I've been talking about so far. This is a PhD project that is about to be completed in my lab at the moment. Clunio marinus here is depicted against the picture of the moon, which is actually relevant for it's a marine insect, very reliant on the tidal cycles, which are, of course, dictated by where the moon is. So the larvae live underwater. The adults emerge at the lowest low tides, and they lay their eggs in usually in seaweed or nearby. And the adults live a ridiculously short. I mean, the adult lifespan is something like 2 hours. Everything happens then. They find each other, they mate, they lay the eggs, and then the water comes back and it's game over for the adults. So it's a remarkable life cycle. And this is a collaboration with Tobias Kaiser, with Runa Ekrem as the PhD student, who has been combining both empirical and theoretical work on this. And this is just the physics of tides. So these lowest low tides here are called the spring tides. Nothing to do with the spring in the year, but it's just the lowest water. And they occur when there's either the new moon or the full moon. And that's also when reproduction happens. And these are the only times when you can see adults. And the question then is that if the larvae are underwater, and they take some time between sort of 6 and 14 weeks, depending on water temperature, to develop, and suddenly they're ready to go. But should they actually go at the first full moon or new moon, new moon, full moon, or should they maybe wait until the next opportunity? And this is interesting because there's diversity in this. There's a so-called semilunar strain that actually does use both moons and just emerges as quickly as possible. But it coexists on various coasts in Europe with, you could call them more patient strains that actually use only the full moon, if that's called the full moon strain, or a strain that uses only the new moon, logically called the new moon strain. So Runa's PhD has been trying to figure out how come this coexistence can happen. So just as a recap, what's happening here, we have the strain that uses both moons. We have one strain for each of the new and full moon. So therefore, I'm plotting all the results in these triangles, where if you're in a particular point here, it means that the population consists of, in these interior points, you have all the 3 different strains present. And if you're in the corner, then here, for example, you would have only the semilunar strain present. Typically, we find something like this when we put the dynamics in there. It's actually quite hard to predict coexistence. So here the arrowheads are pointing in the direction of evolution, and the strength of the color is the kind of speed, like how much genotype change, strain diversity change do you get over one season, which is 1 year, several generations. So if you sort of step back and think, why would you ever wait? If you're ready to go and reproduce, does it actually make sense to wait until there's the next opportunity and not use the most immediate opportunity? And we know, for example, that corals do this quite patient waiting of 1 year before they synchronize everything to spawn together. So maybe you really need to get a proper crowd together for mating purposes, because the adult lifespan is so short. What if you emerge at a mildly wrong time? You don't find anyone, and then you get really zero reproductive success. So this was the basic scenario that I already showed you. If we put these allele effects into the model, it actually makes coexistence worse. So now what we get is these strong priority effects. If you start from nearby, like one strain is already really common, then you just end up with 100% of that strain. You never stay in the middle in any sense. So that didn't really help. We tried all kinds of ideas there. They all work really poorly. Some of them work really, really badly. I will not go through all the results here. They are in the supplementary material. Until this is how the beauty of fieldwork comes in. There was actually a serendipitous finding from the field that made us realize that these insects do some magic, which is to transform time into space. And what I mean by this is that if you think about the sort of geography or kind of like altitudes on a beach, then depending on when you are emerging, that dictates where on a beach you're actually laying your eggs, and therefore also where the larvae will then feed and potentially compete with each other. So the serendipitous finding that happened was that the full and newborn strain, they don't actually emerge. Here's a mating couple. They don't emerge precisely at the same time in relation to the relevant moon, but for whatever reason, the new moon strain actually emerges a few days earlier. And that's when the tides are not quite as deep. And that means that it ends up using the higher parts of the beach. And therefore, you get a spatial segregation. And we produced some absolutely horrible graphs of this. I know that I'm soon running out of time, so therefore I'll just go through this quickly, where you can see that we have 2 different strains here. We have different days of emergence for them. And if they emerged exactly at the same time, then we would always be in the, here are some blue colors here are some yellow color, white colors here. That means that they would end up with extremely strong spatial overlap and therefore zero coexistence. That's what the blue and the white means here. But the same things would also happen if they go 2 weeks away from each other. But if they do something in between, like a few days difference, some sort of lines here, which actually correspond to the empirical findings, then you can get into these black zones here, which in our world indicate, the gray zones here, which in our world indicate coexistence possibilities. And if we actually look at the genotypes of the larvae sampled at different depths, here's the depth below mean sea level. You can see that the ones that are in the shallowest part of the beach, they are a particular genotype score. This then, the deep ones, they are the other genotype score which is related to the full moon. And this here is the new moon strain, so that they really do separate each other nicely in space. So I'll stop there. There was all kinds of examples in this talk, I guess. One of the conclusions is that don't assume that just because you have some sort of temporal differentiation between types that automatically promotes coexistence, because it was actually quite hard for us to produce that in the model. The reason being that the larvae still end up competing with each other quite easily, unless we also manage to separate them in space. But to the sort of other examples that I was talking to you here, it's kind of all else being equal, it's always nice if you live longer. But there's actually quite a big task then for us to understand why we get this immense variation in lifespan in the onset of senescence, all these fast and slow life histories. And they interact with plasticity, they interact with social behaviors. And generally, I just sort of like this how to keep up-to-date view on senescence. And yeah, there's also other ongoing work in my lab about that topic. So I think it's just time to thank all the wonderful people from old times as well as the new ones who are currently in my lab. For example, Runa is defending her thesis next month. So she has just submitted it, and we look forward to the examiner's comments about that. And I think with that, I think it's just time to go for questions. So that was it.